Hello and welcome to this MBA webinar on bringing the power of play to business schools with Prime. I'm Elle Bucket, Insight Content and PR Manager, and I'm really looking forward to having an hour of very interesting insights shortly. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Meredith Storey to kick things off, but just before I do, some housekeeping. We want this session to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, just add them to the question box for us to answer live at the end. And if you miss anything, don't worry, because the recording and slides will be available in the post-event comms and on the MBA websites within about a week. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Meredith.
Thank you very much. And it's so wonderful to be joining you all today. I see that the participants list is starting to populate along the side. So as you come in, as Elle just said, please use the chat. Please use the questions and answers features. Usually when we do these sorts of webinars, we like to be able to see the participants' faces, but then it's a meeting, not a webinar. So we understand there are standards to uphold here, but we would still like to have that playful element here, that we want to hear your voices, that we want to hear your opinions here. So at the start, we'll be talking through, next slide, please, just a little bit of context and where we are with this project, where we've been, where we're going. Then we'll move a bit more into the content portion to talk about what it is that the I5 project is. We're here today to discuss Prime's impactful 5 pedagogies, of course. And then we'll move into more of a discussion phase, and you can see all of the panelists here talking through their experiences, talking through what's worked in the classroom and what their journey's been like throughout the last year that they've been working with the I5 project. So to begin, yes, just the vision of I5. So I5, as I said, stands for the impactful 5, but this is an image that comes to us from Lego work that's been previously done in early childhood development, from the Prime Community, the Principles for Responsible Management Education Initiative, and all of us working together through this community and through the wider communities such as AMBA to consider the holistic skill sets that we'd like to see in business leaders, that we'd like to see in our students. And how do we do that? Through business schools, through the educators, through those that are here today, by creating playful interventions, thoughtful interventions, interventions that make you pause in your classroom and think, how can I make meaning or joy or active engagement or social iteration or iteration, yes, for the classroom? How can I pause? How can I create meaning for my students? And how can I help them to grow from there? And ultimately, what we want to see through these characteristics is more of the skill set development there at the end. From the Lego research, which you can see on the slide here, that we are heavily rooted in that foundation there, that we want to see physical, social, creative, emotional, and cognitive skills. So it's more about developing a whole person and less about developing, like who can memorize the most true false answers on the question, who has the right answer when they raise their hand in class. So questioning the student experience through questioning the educator's experience and through questioning the traditional paradigm of what a business school pedagogy looks like. So to pause and reflect on what our story has been, we've been very lucky since at least the last year. So the Lego grant came in late 2021, and that was $6 million from the Lego Foundation to the Principles for Responsible Management Education Initiative. That's the largest grant that the UN Global Compact has ever received. So it's quite an endorsement for what we can really be doing with this connection to the UN to really demonstrate the strength of what creative pedagogy can do in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if you're joining today, it's probably because you're a member of the AMBA community and you're probably quite active in that community. And historically, Prime and AMBA have had a very good connection through the people, through the overlap, and through the content development that we are both pushing for a better future. You can see it in the research that AMBA is presently rolling out. I mean, the graduate skills surveys are very similarly minded to the skills that we'd like to see in our own work. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to be working within communities and across communities to really bring you all to the table. So the research origin is that we build from that impactful research. We then move into the context of business schools worldwide. We have been using Prime as that lens, but this is a very lucky moment in time for us because we have 2 weeks ago hosted the Prime Global Forum. And at the Prime Global Forum, we moved from this kind of private PRME space where this was really a pilot phase for the last year and a half. And the members that you see on the panel are our first pilot representatives, along with a total of 16 to 17 individuals worldwide who were able to join in. So we've moved from this closed door, how can we learn from the I-5, how can we tease out these themes in small group settings, to more what can this mean for the world and what can this mean for classrooms around the world. So it's been a brilliant moment just getting it out into the world, launching. I have it here in hard copy, but the playbook that goes along with this presentation as well, to be able to discuss what goes into this and what we've learned so far so that we can bring it forward to your community. So like I said, we've moved from item 3 here with the prime and the I-5 to the piloting and experimenting and learning with our signatories, but now here to step 5, beyond to that holistic skill set development, which is really the exciting part, because I think the members here will agree that we've learned so much and we've built a small, robust community of practice. But that community, I mean, we can talk to each other all day long, but the joy of taking this out into the world and hearing what it can mean, or what others believe they're already doing or are already doing, or seeing and learning and teaching together, has really been quite a fun experience. So happy to be joining you today. Next slide. Yep. So to get into the content here, what is the Impactful 5? I've referenced the characteristics and the skill sets just a bit, but those are, I mean, they're buzzwords. We want to talk about what can this look like in a classroom for you. So please go ahead, Sam. Thank you. So you can see here on the screen, there are the 5 characteristics, which would be the bolded words: meaning, joy, social, active, and iterative. But that's been teased out by some wonderful partners that we've been working with at Project Zero, which is an educational think tank from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And along with that partnership, we've also been working with Test, the sustainability literacy test from Paris and Marseille, France, to see how we can track these and test these methods. So first we have those characteristics, which have been teased out, and then they've made, so the characteristic would be what's in the circle, the method for what you can do in your classroom is the longer statement. And then off to the side, the more detailed layers that you'll see are signature moves. So what you can do in the classroom, what we're suggesting to make meaning, to make joy, to make social, active, and iterative practice. The partners have helped us outline several examples from the pilot members to discuss what it means to be meaningful, what it means to be joyful. And it's not a limited list. They're very thought-provoking ideas. It's almost like a balloon where once you start, it just gets bigger and bigger. But ideas for what a classroom activity can look like for yourself, or what an idea of good practice might look like. I mean, what works for an accounting classroom might not work for a marketing classroom, but what can you learn from an accounting classroom or a marketing classroom and apply to each other? So the joy that has sparked through the cross-collaboration and interdisciplinarity of these moves is really inspiring. So I'll go into each one in just a bit more detail. Thank you. So to make meaningful in the learning, honoring and emphasizing the existing knowledges and experiences of your students. I don't want to read slides to you all, I know you can read them, but to say the process of role modeling, making sure that you're showing up as your authentic self and you're demonstrating these processes. We can go through each one, but personalizing, making the experience unique to the student and to the characteristics and behaviors and history that they've shared amongst themselves. Surfacing, bringing their own ideals to light, making sure you can understand where they're coming from. And dignifying, really kind of sustaining on to what they've been doing, to building from what they've learned, to honoring their own experiences and making them feel like they can connect in the classroom. Joy and well-being, it's my favorite, at least. I don't know if it's everyone's favorite, but I think that this is the one that can really make you want to get out of bed and do things a bit differently in your classroom. See, when I taught throughout my PhD, and the students were my own age, and so I think I would wake up in the morning with a bit of anxiety, like, well, what if this lesson doesn't work? And so the one, fostering joy and well-being in your classroom is something that speaks a bit more specifically, because I think it is the goal that students want to love the subject matter as much as you do. And when I would stand in front of the classroom and teach business ethics, it's a hard subject to get people jazzed about, but when you can get into the criticality of the issues and digging through people's own opinions on things, and when people get sharing and talking and discussing, that's the beauty. So to be able to foster joy and well-being in a classroom can really be such a beautiful thing. So delighting, understanding what appeals to the students, how you can make joyful experiences, sensing, being able to tell the network and navigate your classroom, being able to understand what's there and uncover, contemplating, to be able to think through and just understand, are we working together? Are we thinking oppositionally? How can we have these critical conversations together? How can we work through them and find joy in the agreements and the disagreements and teasing out those issues? And rippling like a wave, sending an idea out into the classroom and seeing how it's received. So some very interesting topics here, and I think we can return to joy. Many of the panelists here do have joyful examples of things that have worked for them, but just to be thinking that is a fun one. We also have developing socially supportive social interactions. So I know that I'm coming up on my time here, so I don't want to keep going too long on each and every one, but to speak a bit more, because social interaction can be so important, especially as we're returning from this virtual environment, when we're coming into the classroom, when students might not want to be as social as students 10 years ago were. How can you make animated experiences? How can you bring it out of them? How can you get them excited for the class? How can you make authentic learning experiences where they know what's going on in that classroom? They want to feel like they can be their whole authentic self and work with others to learn from each other. How can you link? How can you build from previous experiences? Facilitating active engagement, that's also an important one when tied especially to social inclusion, but active engagement ties to each of them as well, and making joy and making movement and making meaning. Getting them up out of their chairs. There's one professor who is actually a sustainable finance professor, and he does Tai Chi at the start of his classes to center his students. And when we started these pilots, we thought those sustainable finance professors, they're not going to want to play with us. And he came here on the first day and said, you know what I did? I challenged myself and I brought active engagement into the classroom as a form of reflection. And in sustainable investing, it's about understanding your values. So I do see them as aligned. So sometimes the things that seem a bit more distant are actually quite close. And we've really enjoyed learning from those practices too. The final one here is iteration. And Dirk, you might be our iteration expert, so I don't want to go too far down this either if you're going to be drawing on some examples. But it's making sure that that feedback process is there, that students can see the link between what they're doing and where they're going, the mission between their work in the world, their work in business, their work in civil society. It's a matter of seeing connections, of receiving feedback, of being able to act and react. So it seems like a basic process, but when we think about how, in the system I was in, you might not get feedback until the final exam, and by then they're out of the door, and there's not really a method for feedback that's truly iterative. So to be thinking through, if you are in a system that says that feedback must be delivered in a certain way, how can iterations still be built in even beyond assessment? Thank you, Sam. That is the general gist of things. And like I said, we have this playbook here. So Sam, I'll leave you to speak a bit more to how resources can engage for the future, but I'm happy to continue this conversation afterwards. And it's just so nice to see the AMBA community here with us today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Meredith. And as Meredith went through all of those characteristics, we really hope you were starting to think, oh, maybe I do implement some of these in my classroom already, or, oh, I haven't thought about doing that specific idea in my classroom yet. And that's really where I think the playbook comes in. This I5 playbook was developed by our partners at Project Zero and really goes into each of those moves and signature moves to kind of break apart what we mean when we're talking about the I5 characteristics, but also gives really helpful examples and reflection space. So I really recommend you use the QR code on the screen here. We can also drop the link in the chat later so that you can access the playbook, but it is now widely available, so you don't need to have a printed copy to use it. It is available online, and I really encourage you to use it as a method to start going through some of your classroom practices that you're already using and really get started with I5. But beside the playbook, one of the biggest tools that we have is our community, and we have several members of that community on the screen with us today. So I'm really excited for them to go into examples of teaching practices. They've been with I5, I think, for over a year now and really engaging with that in their classroom. So they've built community of practices and been able to already inspire so many of the Prime community and hopefully the AMBA community now as well. So I will hand it over to them.
Hello. Shall we introduce ourselves a little bit first and then go into the examples? Yeah, that might be nice. So, hello everyone. I'm Natascha Radclyffe-Thomas. I'm a professor in marketing and sustainable business based at the Glasgow Caledonian University's London campus. And I've been part of the expert pedagogy group, which was mentioned a little bit earlier. There's a whole group of us working globally. And on the call today is myself, Dirk and Aurora. Dirk and Aurora, do you want to just say hello quickly before we go on?
Hello, my name is Dirk Moosmayer. I'm professor of strategy and sustainability at the KEDGE Business School on their Bordeaux campus. As a context, I'm German. I worked 8 years in China with an English university before coming to KEDGE, where we're delivering an MBA accredited MBA on our Paris and mainly Marseille campus, including the Bordeaux campus. I'll talk more about that later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natascha. Yes, my name is Aurora Díaz Soloaga, and I teach different subjects, mainly purpose, social responsibility, and leadership in Almaty Management University, in Almaty, the former capital of Kazakhstan. Probably many of you know quite well not only the country but even Almaty. And yes, I have represented the Eurasian chapter of PRIME. In the very same expert group that was mentioned before, and it was an honor. And I will also explain a little bit later, but just to share that it has been a wonderful experience, an inner journey, and something that I'm very happy that we have the chance to share with many people, with you.
So can we have the next slide? So maybe I might have a little bit of the background of some of the work that I was going to talk about. Yay, here we go. So I am a great believer in serendipity. I've been teaching for about 150 years at this point, but my background is I'm a doctor of education, and within that I've focused on creativity, and the discipline that I work in is fashion. So there's all of those things going on. Now, in the past, when I talked about fashion, even in a business and marketing sense, it would always be more about the glamour and the promotions and the positive sides of the creative sides of the industry. But recently, I'm sure everyone cannot have avoided the fact that fashion has a lot of sustainability challenges. So now when I'm working with MBA students and we're looking at topics like sustainable fashion, how do we engage them in a meaningful way that doesn't just drag us all down with gloom and doom and there's no solutions and we're all going to hell in a handbag? And it's a kind of quite a philosophical question for us as educators, because we can see ourselves as part of the system. So I consider myself in education very much connected with the wider fashion industry, because specifically in a subject like fashion education only came from industry. The first fashion schools were technical colleges that came to serve the industry. So we have a very, very strong link, and our graduates directly are the people who are making decisions in the industry as they go into work in it. So a project like the I5, which is seeking to influence responsible leadership characteristics, is really well suited for the sorts of activities that I've been, I suppose, myself playing with and exploring. So one example I wanted to share, which sort of covers a few of the different elements, which came to me as I was teaching. I was actually teaching a class of business students. So in this case, it wasn't fashion students, but I used a lot of case studies, and I was using case studies to talk about some of the environmental and social challenges that the fashion industry has that I won't rehash here. But one of the issues I talked about was textile waste, which is an enormous problem. And I mentioned to the class that many people discard their clothing because, a zip gets broken, they get a tear or a button falls off and they don't know how to mend it. And kind of off the cuff, because these were students I wasn't super familiar with, I just asked, how many people know how to sew on a button? And from the class, you can see the photo on the slide there, actually only 3 people knew how to sew on a button. So with that, my brain synapses whizzed into action, and I said, hey, okay, I'm going to change our assessment slightly. And by the end of this week-long program that I was delivering, part of the assessment will now be that everybody has to learn how to sew on a button. this actually gave me an opportunity to bring joy and well-being into my own teaching experience, because I was teaching in Toulouse Business School, a city that I was not familiar with. So I got to go on a wonderful adventure around an unfamiliar city, sourcing buttons, needles, sewing thread, etc., and fabric to sew buttons on. And this became, you know, the activity that we did, sitting to sew a button on, is actually a very nice way of calming, doing something with your hands. So you're sort of active, but it's actually quite a simple process that allows you to still your mind, but also was a way in to talk about the complexities of fashion, which is undoubtedly, you know, a very complex system. And so by the end of that session, everyone in that class had sewn a button on, and I asked them to do some reflective writing, thinking about this, relating to all the different areas that we've been thinking about in sustainable sort of fashion and responsible business, and what that meant to them. And I think these kind of activities can seem very simple, but they allow you to investigate with your students very complex systems. They allow you also to engage with topics that do have meaning for students. And I'm sure people on the call will know that in the last couple of years, many students are interested in their own, both their personal kind of influence on sustainability in areas like food or fashion, but also in the careers that they can be going into and how those careers can be meaningful. And so as a member of the expert pedagogy group, I had the opportunity to share just such examples, and we could kind of interrogate them and pull them apart to see how we were engaging students kind of with head, with hands, with heart, and making the sort of connections between these sort of very simple classroom activities to wider global systems and where we could put our impact. And it's something that I'd actually, you know, had written about and thought about in a pedagogic sense. But for me, what the I5 has done has been, and Meredith mentioned the word lens, it's been a lens with which I kind of analysed some of the things that I have done and thought about future activities and see how I can bring these pieces together. And actually, because I teach fashion business, people often get confused that we're making things. In business, we're not making. It could be like any other business classroom, but actually bringing materials into a classroom, doing things with our hands. And I'm increasingly thinking of different ways of doing this. And so I think that's just one example that I hope resonates with other people. But I've also used this in staff development as well. So as a way of having conversations around things like teaching. So I encourage everyone, pick up your needle and thread, get sewing those buttons. Thank you so much. I think I'm handing over to Dirk.
Can I just ask a question? I mean, in the spirit of making sure that we do get active engagement here, when we talk to the Lego Foundation, I mean, I think we're very transparent about where our funding sources come from. Like, they're a fun, tactile group as well. And from their other projects that they have funded in adult learning, the value of artifacts is very well recognized. So when you set out to do this, did you know that they were going to be able to find that inner peace by doing the hand mind play?
I hadn't thought about it as such, but I actually do hand knitting and I like hand sewing, and unless it gets in a horrible knot, in which case it's not very peaceful. But actually, I don't know what sense, it's how we sometimes separate our personal and professional lives. So I hadn't actually considered bringing those sort of practices in, but I myself really enjoy being part of, say, a knitting group or stitching, you know, stitching and bitching, those types of things. So I think it's very much a way that you can, but now with this kind of lens, I'm thinking more about how finding that peace and stillness. And I'm also thinking of ways that you can integrate that more generally. Really interesting, as a slight aside, in the early days of the London College of Fashion, students used to have to sit and hand sew buttonholes, as they called the register. And that was sort of, and I was thinking, gosh, I don't know that we could quite do that now, but managing a button is probably most of us could do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One thing I did not mention before, I'm kind of representing on the expert pedagogy group, the chapter of France and Benelux. As I said, in spite of being German, coming with quite some UK experience. Some of the feedback we've heard is that people either say, oh, we're doing this already, or people might think, well, this doesn't work here. And I'm taking the French context of how we deliver an MBA in a French context to think a bit about that. The French education system is generally very lecture-based. It is very classroom-centered. As a result of this and also of the fact that our MBA speaks very much to professionals. Means we're not taking them full-time, full semester out, but they've got often blocks, either kind of Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or a week-long course, but then they take 1 week of break or holiday and move on with that. So with this in mind, as Meredith said, I'm an expert on iteration. Thank you for clarifying. I thought before, iteration is the one way I felt I have to develop further, right? So for many of the other things, I've got a lot to say, but in iteration, I'm not particularly good, and that's particularly challenging when you're in a context where you have to build iterations in 3 days where you're all the time together, and the idea is do something from week to week. Maybe you give students feedback because you have, as an educator, also the time of a week to kind of work on the student submissions and then have these iterations through that. That doesn't really work as much. So there are things on that. But overall, in the teaching session that I have here, there's less space for iteration and there is less space for outside engagement. So also do something between today and tomorrow doesn't work as much, because the reality is often we're scheduling 8 hours classroom time per day with an hour, or in France, perhaps 2 hours lunch break. So there isn't as much time when I send them away in the evening and say, do that until tomorrow. That has limits. I want to start with one example that is also mentioned in the physical playbook on page 32, but there comes the value of the online version, because in the online version there's actually a link to a survey that I use to understand what do my students want first, in terms of, for me, tell me who you are, and in order for your learning, right, tell me what you're looking for. So why are you here? What do you expect to get out of that course? That allows me 2 things. First, in terms of making it meaningful, I know whom I'm speaking to. I can adjust my contents, but also it allows me to design activities that very much put the students and the learners into the driver's seat. So it's one way of kind of facilitating active engagement, and say, rather than me doing everything, I'm supervising a learning process that you, the learners, are doing. And that's why I want to add some examples. Typically, I try to think of, well, how can we do these things, both iterations, but also active engagement, for example. I can bring students in on the level of the course design. So the earlier I know them, and that's where that survey comes in and is important. Of course, the requirement here is that I know these students quite early. So if I'm the first course on a program and they're just starting, that's a challenge I had earlier this academic year. And then we can kind of say, well, what do we do in the course delivery, but also in the assessment? And kind of Meredith mentioned who can memorize is typically not what we're looking for. Well, maybe we are, but we could ask this, who can memorize in a way that it becomes iterative and in a way that it becomes actively engaging. Do you like MCQ questionnaires and exams at the end of your assessment? Often enough people wouldn't say, well, we don't like this because they're so standard, they're just ticking boxes and they don't help me to learn. They're pure knowledge assessment. I do think sometimes there is value in also, as one component, assessing knowledge. I use them covering about 20% of the mark, but I use them in a way that at the end of every session, or in a 3-day block course, at the end of every half day, I ask students, please develop MCQ questions together with the answers and post them. So all of you have access to them and I have access to them. And then I may moderate them a bit and I pick some of those questions. Also, typically at the end of a course, they have produced about 100 reasonable questions, and I pick 20 of them and give them to them as an exam. So it allows me, for them, they kind of recover the repeating, they're thinking at the end of every session, what have I actually learned from that? They also put themselves into the shoes of an assessor, so they learn some perspective taking, and they learn from each other, right? They kind of take this meaningfulness of not once, well, there's this professor who kind of asked us a stupid MCQ that we don't like, but hey, we are actually responsible for this learning and we produce this ourselves. That works quite well. Interestingly, also with the marking range, so often we kind of normal curve, how does that work? In the French system, we received something between 14 to 15 out of 20 points, translates into 75% roughly, which is something we'd be looking for. So that works very well. It's not that everybody knows everything because they had everything up front. That's one thing. A second example that gets a bit more into iterations is that I'm using a reflective journal that usually I would say after each session from week to week, note down, and we're using Blackboard as a technical tool, and in Blackboard there is a journal function which I activate, and then I'm giving them the framework that is similar to the KSA framework, and so I'm asking them, well, reflect on what you know and how what you know has developed over that session or from week to week ideally. So if that's from week to week, I would actively encourage them to include experiences and learning from outside the classroom during that. What have you learned in terms of knowing? What have you become able to do that you had before? And how has the session or the kind of week-long experience affected your personality or your professional values and beliefs? So we're kind of coming on this knowledge, skills, and aptitudes framework. And then we have them note down and reflect on this. And ideally, I would give them feedback. As we see, kind of giving feedback to a cohort of 20 or more people, if from one day to another may be complicated, difficult. There again, you could bring in the other students and say, well, then kind of give each other peer feedback, look at these aspects and kind of contribute, kind of explain to each other how you feel about that and what your perspective. I would still try to moderate as much, and by using a technology platform, the advantage is that I can overlook everything. I see all the interactions, so I can guide them and kind of focus on those where I feel there is most interaction needed. That's a bit from my side at the moment, and I'm excited to listen to Aurora. Thank you very much.
There are a few questions coming into the chat, but I think we'll save them for the end if that's okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Aurora.
Thank you. Yes, so well, actually, I cannot avoid also sharing some thoughts about what have meant to join this experience and to yes, to get the best of not only the very community of practice that we have created, but also through the entire process of embracing a new pedagogy, testing it, and making it a reality in my classes, in my daily teaching activity, which is something that very naturally my peers already done, because it's firstly, as I say when I introduce myself, is that this has been for myself, but I guess for each of us, has been an inner journey, because we reflected a lot about our very own way of teaching, why we teach, why we would like to see our teaching to become something transformative for students, and what means to go every day to the classes to give the best of yourself, trying to evoke and to create on the students a new way of watching reality, right, and making them real agents of change for their own future, but also for the future of their societies. So as I said, I work in Kazakhstan, which is a very interesting society, a multinational, a multicultural reality. So for me, precisely the process of rethinking the way I teach has been very connected as well with the way I facilitate social interaction. And if you don't mind, I will focus much more on this specific method of the 5 ones that we suggested and that we tried and that we tested. Why? Because precisely I believe, and I already checked, that the entire system, the I5, has a great potential precisely to promote peace, to promote a more responsible, society, but by the specific way of nurturing more tolerant and more open citizens. So it's something that I have checked many times at class, precisely while I'm designing. And this is something interesting that I always love to hear my colleagues sharing their experiences, because it's so, I mean, you can see more or less, I mean, it's like a very interesting process of seeing what you have perceived in others' words. So they already say about reflecting, design, and testing is something that we have done during this year and a half. And yes, focusing much more on the social, yes, in the specific move of enhance and develop supportive social interaction. I just wanted to share a specific example because it's something that probably for many of you is not that far. It's something that probably in your institutions, in your universities, you have been working with perhaps for a couple of years or for even many years, which are any kind of international or at least classroom exchanges in a more global or regional, at least, environment. So in AlmaU, in Almaty Management University, we created 3 years ago the Global Social Impact Fellowship, which is a collaboration between Almaty Management University, AlmaU, and Lehigh University from Pennsylvania. And we, as many of you, I believe, already are doing as well, we promoted cross-cultural exchanges to provide solutions to shared challenges. Well, sounds like the typical global experience for the students, but my specific contribution there, let's say, is that I try to transform this into a lab for the I5 movements and the I5 experience. And this is something that I guess that many of you could do as well. So while creating those projects, we try to promote research capacities in the students, but focusing very much precisely on ethical awareness, on a social and civic approach, more responsible approach, and it helped a lot precisely to promote that communifying, that raving, bridging and teaming movements that Meredith, for instance, suggested that are some of the movements that are included precisely in this method of precisely developing social interaction. So as I told you, in the context of Kazakhstan, and more specifically in the context of Almaty, I could have in a specific classroom students from perhaps at least 5 different backgrounds, cultural and social backgrounds, 5, 6, 7, I mean, different countries, or at least inside Kazakhstan, but from different ethnicities. And it's not always that simple, and it's very often quite challenging, precisely to create such an open atmosphere, a safe perception for the students to really be at class. I mean, in a way that they believe that they are in a safe place and they can promote something common with other students, and much more if we are even increasing the challenge, because we are working with a group of students, in this case from the US. The experience that could be very stressing, or at least challenging, became a wonderful lab for them to precisely to promote those approaches and those attitudes precisely that I believe that will transform them for their better future. And I just would like to finish saying that even when Meredith explained a little bit the way we are also developing an assessing method for the I5, this is something that I perhaps repeat many times, that these movements are also challenging and interesting, and sometimes even even not scary, but something that call the best of us, because not always we can measure in the short term how effective they are, right? I mean, it's precisely because we are not speaking about what we teach, the content, but the way we teach. We sometimes have the feeling that it's not that easy to measure, but well, precisely is the long term that here matters. And even when we are putting the best of us and facing that feeling of, oh, I cannot even say if for them, I mean, if they have the feeling that they have learned during this class, but the reality is that, well, even during this year and a half, I believe that, and also the rest of us, we already check well, changes in the students, and also how they provide their feedback about how they felt the entire experience. From my side, I guess that this is what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, each of you. I'll pass to Sam just for the open discussion from the questions.
Yeah, thank you all that have already submitted questions. And if you have other questions that you think of while we're talking, feel free to add those into the Q&A and we will frame those for the panel. And the first question I want to get started with is from an attendee. It says, can you say anything about whether the I-5 playbook approach works better on certain educational levels? So whoever wants to speak to that, feel free to take it.
I'm happy to have a go. I've taught at all different levels, and I think actually these sorts of principles, it's not really to do with age, stage, or even subject. It's about being human and holistic. So whilst you might be thinking about the content, or you might think of you know, arranging different attention spans and that kind of thing, but I think the I-5 playbook, I mean, primarily it's about responsible leadership, but it's grounded in pedagogies that have interestingly come from the Lego Foundation's research with younger children. And really the idea behind the project was, can these apply within a business school context? So it was kind of, can they work? And I guess what we've been trying to work out is, yes, they can. And these are the ways in which we're doing this. So I think I don't feel that it has, and I think as we've seen from the examples, I mean, Dirk's talking about very short, snappy interventions. My week-long program was, but also I've been thinking about designing, you know, semester-long programs using these techniques. And actually, as I said, I've really been thinking about how to use some of these in professional development sessions. And because I attend quite a few educational kind of fora, often when I talk about these examples, or I get people to engage in these examples, their takeaway is, oh, I'm going to use this with staff, actually. So I think it's more a kind of approach. And what people have fed back to me, because there's been quite a lot of interest, is it's almost like giving you permission to try something different and giving you permission to take a risk. And as Dirk was saying, sometimes within these, we might actually gravitate to something that doesn't come naturally to us, to say, how has somebody else done this thing that I actually struggle with, rather than going to the moves or the plays that are come more naturally to us. And in that sense, I think it helps promote, you know, the power of great pedagogy wherever and however it's happening. But I'd be interested in a sense to know where that question's come from. So whether you're feeling that has a different perspective, or you're thinking about how you might apply that. But that's what I would say in response to that question. Thank you.
To kind of give a behind the curtain response to that too, we have been very intentional throughout the language of the playbook to make sure that what's being like the subject is those skills developments. And Natascha put so beautifully that it's more about the human aspect than it is about your age or your stage. Because the playbook has that implication that this is about what comes out on the other side. Even the business school language is the examples reflect business school education, but it's a bit more universal so that it can be understood from a 101 class to an MBA class, that there's the ability to tease out deeper themes there as well.
Great. Unless anyone wants to speak to that as well, we can move to the next question I have one from an attendee that would like to know a little bit more about how student-to-student coaching could work with the playbook framework.
I'm not going to stall the show, but I will propose, because I remember a specific activity that Dirk promoted as an assessment, and I guess that could be a great example of this this proposal. Dirk, I'm sure you know the one I mean.
Dirk, you're
I think
muted.
you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
Yes, so you would find that as an example on page 90 in the playbook, but I didn't know that Aurora would be pushing me to that one. So what I've done in an assessment format again, which I personally wouldn't have interpreted as student-to-student coaching, but you could, is an exam format. As a school requires me to have an exam at the end of the course. So I tell students they'll have an exam without being too specific what will actually happen. And then they receive a sheet of paper with 3 boxes on it. And then on the PowerPoint, I show them, well, now in box 1, please put a question that is reasonable and meaningful for the course content that we have. Then on the next slide, now pass on your sheet to a second student. Then the second student, please answer the question in box 1, and then pass it on to a third student and kind of write an assessment on the question in box 2 to question in box 1. And as a last step, all 3 get together and agree on the mark for your paper. And because I've set them up in a way that each of them have kind of circulated among the 3, so they 3 can talk about the quality of their work and what mark they would give. So that's one step in that direction, which you could say, or it could be kind of playful because it's really something different. You can see that as meaningful because it's the question that the students themselves took out of that class. And it's socially interactive because they have to deal with these things. That's the one approach. I think in terms of more traditional student-to-student coaching, I do think they're absolutely in line with the playbook. I do think a challenge that we generally have is that question, where do we as educators still overlook the situation and kind of become true to the responsibility that we have to design that learning experience and make sure that it works. So I think it's very useful and important that we give as much autonomy and responsibility for their own learning to students, but in a way that we overlook and intervene when it's not going well. I do think that the student-to-student coaching is very clearly a form of active engagement. It's very clearly about social interaction. So in terms of describing it and putting some of the I5 labels on it, that would not be the problem. So from that perspective, I clearly see it as an I5 activity, always there with a challenge. We need to see how we can implement our own role in the specific setting. That depends very much on the question if I've got a 15 people MBA class or if I'm speaking to a 600 people undergrad audience or what I'm working.
Thanks, Dirk. Any other responses? Otherwise, we have one more question from the chat, and feel free to keep adding those questions if you think of any more. All right. Next question that we have is, do you have any specific tips on how to make online learning more playful and interactive?
I can start. I think doing some activities where you get people to do treasure hunts and share things is fun. It's an activity that we did with physical objects when we were doing, when we've been doing some of our get-togethers of go and find an object that brings you joy and share it on the screen and say something about it, but also just sending people off on digital treasure hunts and finding things. I often use emojis in the chat just to, for shorthand on how we're all feeling at the beginning and end of sessions. But I think in a sense that online in person, we don't really want to divide them, because actually you want to think about how you're engaging in both spaces, and we mustn't sort of assume that we're engaged just because we're in the same physical space. I think in both spaces it's about bringing people's attention and their mindfulness to that space. So something I've actually started to do more of since engaging with the I5 project is taking a couple of minutes at the beginning of a session, whether that's a presentation or a class, to actually make sure everyone's grounded and in the space and ready, you know, phones away if phones need to be away and that kind of thing. So I think, you know, as a sense, as educators, we're desperate to talk all the time and cram content into sessions, but actually some of the I5-ness reflection is how to make space. And actually one of the really important things is that people feel calm, comfortable, collected, you know, and I know as an educator, we often imagine people just leave our classroom, whether that's online or in person, don't have any other life or interactions, and then come back into our classroom. We kind of forget all the bits that have happened in between. So again, I think thinking about how you regroup and bring people back into that space, and that would definitely help, you know, again, with the connections and the social interaction, and actually making space for people to have lives that exist outside the classroom. We don't need to know all about them, but I think even in just recognizing that. But I think it's changing things up a bit, and one of the elements of joy and well-being is surprise. So I think it can sometimes be that. Just think about how you can put a little nice surprise into your class, whether that's using music or a clip of, I don't know, some theatre or ballet that you like to start the class. I used to do that a lot when I had huge registers to take, just put on a fashion show in the background and do your register, just sort of little, I don't know, connections and things that can make people feel calmer, happier, connect, maybe give them something to talk about. But I also think people like to talk to each other. So doing those exercises like pairing and sharing, which are easy to do in chats as much as they are in real life. I think that's a few from me. Thank you.
So the first course actually I had to teach here at KEDGE. I arrived here in February 2020. First thing, arrival. Second thing, they tell me lockdown, stay at home, don't talk to anybody. Third thing, they tell me now teach an MBA class on ethics, sustainability, and CSR. And I felt that through that experience, I was very much actually pushed to be more, or think through and be in my own planning much more detailed and careful about where do I expect what kind of iteration, what kind of engagement of the students. And to some extent, unless you're the person who says, oh, online teaching for me means I take my 3-hour lecture and I now speak this to a screen and they can watch the video. If you're not that kind of person, but you're having inputs and you have them to do some things and so on, then you would think much more carefully, and you're much stronger on actually building in student engagement, building in activities for the students. Think about what can they take out of that, clarifying for them the questions, because it needs to be everything in the system there, right? You can't walk around and look if this works well. So you need to be much more detailed and prepared and doing a better job in actually delivering on all these elements. And that also means kind of some extra materials for those who want to look a bit more here and there, trying to kind of facilitate some engagement, online social engagement between students or participants, which may of course be challenging. So the core idea here was something asynchronous. Might have mentioned that before. So it's not that we meet for 3 hours and work together, but it's something that I have to produce that allows the learners to do it when it works for them. And I think that's a very useful exercise, right? If you push yourself into that way and say, let me design this course as if I would design it as an asynchronous course, and you do that well, then you got it very right. And then anything you can take back in the classroom will usually work better, because the moment you have people face to face, it's just, you've got more joy and well-being.
And perhaps a last thought about this. I believe that also, well, my experience also, I mean, perhaps quite connected with the ones that my colleagues has just shared, but also all the efforts that we could do to nurture a different relationship with the teacher helps a lot to create a sense of joy, precisely. And well, perhaps this depends a lot on the social context in which you are teaching, but sometimes that relationship could be quite formal or even a little bit authoritative. So I already checked that creating a close relationship and an open one, a confident one, for them is a very good beginning for the entire course, because they start thinking about the classroom and the entire experience in a very different way. So create those links and those relationship with the teacher much more relaxing and much more holistic also, because it's that they start to watching a task, to watch a task like from a very different perspective. This is not only that person who should translate me that big amount of information, but someone real, with real feelings, with even sometimes real problems. So yes, I believe that that's also a very simple, perhaps, way to make the experience much more joyful. Yeah.
I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I have a question for each of you. You've been on this journey for a year now. You've really been engaging with this. You've been walking the talk. You're there. The people that are tuning in today and hearing this conversation for the first time, what advice would you have for taking this to maybe a trickier student cohort who you're not sure how to approach, or colleagues in your department who you want to talk to about this? You think it might benefit their coursework, but you're not sure how to begin the conversation. What advice would you have just from the journey that you've been on?
Shall I go first? First of all, I think it depends very much how much experience you have in either teacher training, education, pedagogy, because if it's something that you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about or studying, that's the sort of go-to, which I think the playbook is great because it's got a lot of that condensed within it. I think it's finding people. So starting having those conversations. I mean, for example, using the PRIME network. PRIME is a global organization. There's a lot of people outside this call involved. So I would sort of reach out and start to try and find those networks of supportive colleagues. I think sometimes we don't have enough time to talk about teaching, and that's a really important thing. But then I would say try something really small that's quite low risk as your first thing, rather than thinking you're like redoing the entire curriculum. Maybe you just concentrate on one class and just have a little go and see how that goes. That would probably be my tip, and enjoy it.
Dirk, if you don't mind. Well, that's probably the 1 million question, because we are all still trying to find the best way to inoculate this new way of thinking about education, about teaching. I would say be as enthusiastic as you can, because this is something that could become viral. Yes, because of our examples, I mean, role model in some way. If they see that not only our faces, but also our students' faces are being transformed. And I guess that as Natascha just say, I mean, we don't spend that much time speaking about the way we teach and the way we can learn from each other, and the way, so perhaps being enthusiastic about, well, I discovered something that could change the way you teach and the way you go to class every single day. I mean, something that can become attractive, yeah, can become.
Adding to those two, and perhaps going a step further, I do think that one thing, what the structure is very useful for, what often we're kind of, well, what could I do? How could I teach differently? And I think it's important for us at first to say, this is a terminology and a framework which we can use to at first plot what we're actually doing. And so far in the past 1.5 years, we haven't been speaking much about that because we wanted to more push boundaries and try out new things. I do think that idea of having a clear terminology where we can write down and allocate us and is very useful. One, for identifying. It clearly gives me the terminology to say, I feel I need to improve on iteration and I want to do more there. But also it allows me to talk to Natascha and Aurora, or to 5 colleagues kind of back home in my school, about how do you actually feel about them. It allows them to plot that, and it then allows kind of a starting base for a discussion on how we can help each other developing in the respective fields. Do you want to have another comment?
No, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. And I know that we're at time, so thank you all for bearing with us as we go through. We did give you the abstract timeline of where we have been and where we're going at the start, but just to pave it out a bit more clearly, we did do the public launch of the Prime Global Forum 2 weeks ago, although it feels like a year ago and just yesterday all at once. So those key community resources, the playbook, the slides, these conversations they're just more public at this stage. So come on board. Feel free to email us at i5@unprime.org, and we're happy to get back to you, plugging you into opportunities and engagement. Looking to the future, we do have 2 years left on this grant, so we're going to continue to build from the lessons of the expert pedagogy group, of our Prime Champions community, and our working groups that focus on issue-specific pieces of the puzzle, developing research opportunities, developing stakeholder connections, and just looking to continue the growing and the scaling process for educator skills building, working with the other work streams within Prime. Our SIP reporting process is changing as well, so we're happy to plug into that narrative. If your school is a Prime signatory, your school is not, you are still welcome on board. This is an inclusive process, and we hope to have as many on board as possible. So please reach out. I'm Storey at UN Global Compact. Sam is Thompson at UN Global Compact, or the i5 account as well. And we look forward to sharing afterwards with you as much as possible. So thank you, and thanks, Amba, for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you all for this amazing webinar, and thank you for everyone who joined and interacted and asked questions. I hope you all enjoyed this session as much as I did, but if you missed anything again, don't worry, because the recording and slides will be available in the post-event comms and on the MBJ website within a week. So yeah, thank you very much again, and goodbye. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.